It gives me really great pleasure to introduce Dr. Kathleen Alves. Her talk today, titled Girlhood, Displacement, and Resistance During the Japanese Occupation, is the last event in a year-long colloquia series titled Fleeing Genocide, Displacement, Exile, and the Refugee, for which Dr. Alves is one of the principal coordinators. Thanks to funding from the National Endowment for the Humanities and through the auspices of the Kupferberg Holocaust Center, this series has spent the year examining, with the participation of the students here at QCC and the surrounding community, the concept of displacement and the refugee. Together, we discussed and met refugees and asylum seekers from historic and ongoing conflicts, and explored the events shaping their flights, as well as their challenges resettling in new countries, which are increasingly hostile to their presence. Thank you to the NEH and the Kupferberg Holocaust Center, to Dan Lesham and Marissa Hollywood, who have made events like today possible. We are also truly fortunate today to have Dr. Alves' family with us, and I thank you for being here. Thank you also to the Journalism Club, led by Professor Cercone, and the Creative Writing Club, led by Professor Miller, who will be participating in a roundtable following Dr. Alves' talk. Having this engagement with our students, who are our future voters, activists, global citizens, is really key to colloquia events like this, and we're really happy to see you here. Today's talk focuses on the concept of internal displacements. Internally displaced people are those forced from their homes, but who have not crossed a national border to find safety. As the United Nations High Commission on Refugees points out, internally displaced people, by staying within the reach of their own governments, even if their government is the reason for their displacements, are among the most vulnerable people in the world. The Internal Displacement Monitoring Center notes that in 2015 alone, there were 27.8 million new displacements in 127 countries that were caused by conflict, violence, and disasters. This number does not even reflect those languishing in camps and other zones of displacement from prior years, which would total almost 41 million people. While protracted crises in the Democratic Republic of Congo, Iraq, Nigeria, South Sudan, and Syria have contributed to this number, the plight of internally displaced people is not limited by location, by race, religion, gender, or orientation. It is not something limited to elsewhere. In her essay, When Home is a Camp, Global Sovereignty, Biopolitics, and Internally Displaced Persons, Kalpana Rahita Shahadri notes that the phenomenon of internally displaced people is a blind spot, as she explains, in the very center of modern notions of sovereignty. While the refugee has the attempts, however tenuous, to seek safety elsewhere, an internally displaced person is, as Shahadri puts it, a refugee who has no refuge. The internally displaced person reminds us of nation-states' capacity to abandon the political subject, for power's potentiality to function by not functioning. The existence of internally displaced people should recall to all of us the limits of globalism and the instability that we are all potentially subject to. Today's talk also touches on the concept of childhood disrupted by violence and war. It calls to mind for me a poem by Marianne Pileski called Colors of a Free Life, in which, while describing a youth filled with war and constant fear, she imagines another world outside of the circumstances in which she lives, one alienated from the horrors of combat. In one stanza she notes, "Whenever someone screamed, I thought of people in other parts of the world quietly raking their gardens or sitting in outdoor cafes over espressos with music, reading their paper in different languages. People who had done nothing wrong and deserved a good life. People whose dogs and cats didn't fight. People with plenty to eat and dreams rather than nightmares. The husband went to work, not to war. The wife washed her hair each morning as dew washes the grass. Their children were not afraid to wake up. They trusted life, knowing its roads would lead wherever they expected to go. Today, Dr. Alves brings many of these ideas together. She takes us back to World War II, to the Philippines during the Japanese occupation, and to the struggles and survival of her family in these circumstances. Please join me in thanking and welcoming Dr. Alves as she gives her talk today.
Thank you, Alisa. Welcome, everyone. I'd like to start first by thanking my colleagues who worked on this year-long colloquia with me, Professors Alisa Atik and Myrna Lekic. Thank you also to the Kupferberg Holocaust Resource Center, to its director, Dan Lesham, and to its assistant director, Marissa Holloway, who is holding back the fort back there. Okay. As a professor of English, I've always naturally been drawn to narratives, to stories. So for today, while I have you here with me, I'd like to share two stories about two little girls who lived through a confusing, violent, and turbulent time as internally displaced people as a result of conflict. So these are the stories of my grandmothers as young girls during the Japanese occupation of the Philippines. So what exactly is an internally displaced person or refugee? And Alisa kind of touched up upon this. Sorry. English professor, not professor of engineering. Okay. So according to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, internally displaced people have not crossed a border to find safety. So unlike refugees in the traditional sense, they're on the run at home. While they may have fled for similar reasons, IDPs stay within their own country and remain under the protection of its government, even if that government is the reason for their displacement. And as a result, these people are among the most vulnerable in the world. By the end of 2015, there were 41 million people internally displaced worldwide as a result of conflict and violence. This does not even include disaster. This is the highest figure the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center has ever recorded. In 2015, IDPs outnumbered refugees by 2 to 1. By the end of 2015, 3/4 of the world's IDPs were located in only 10 countries. 5 countries have featured in the top 10 list of countries with the largest displaced populations every year since 2003, and they are Colombia, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Iraq, Sudan, and South Sudan. So for today, I'd like to go back in time a little bit and share my family's story as internally displaced people during the Japanese occupation of the Philippines between 1942 and 1945, and to give an insight on how displacement impacts civilian experiences. In many ways, displacement is a story of survival, of escape from the very real possibilities of persecution and death. But displacement is also a story of heroism. For these individuals have shown great solidarity in their suffering and will to persevere, even in the face of great danger. So I'd like to think that some of these heroes are in the stories that I will feature for today. So how exactly did the Philippines get involved? World War II interrupted the Commonwealth period of the Philippines, which basically means that the country became the property of America after the Spanish-American War of 1891. And the Philippines was of strategic importance to America as its central line of communication in the Pacific. So you can see here in the map, right, you have the western seaboard of the United States and the vastness of the Pacific Ocean, and then you have the Philippines right here. And you have Japan right up here and larger China. So it's almost a direct line, right, to the Asian countries. So it's serious strategic importance for America to have it and to have its bases there. Before World War II, Japan was a fast-rising imperial power and looked to absorb the Philippines as part of its ideological project, and this is a mouthful, co-prosperity sphere in the greater East Asia, in eradicating Western influence. side of the map. Manchuria, over here, was occupied in 1932. It invaded China in 1937, and it invaded Indochina in 1940s. So Indochina are the countries of Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos today. So as you can see, they were slowly making their way down further south, and the Philippines seem to be its next logical target for occupation. So in anticipation of any attack from the Japanese, which seems imminent, in July of 26th of July 1941, the Philippine Reserve and Regular Forces incorporated into the U.S. Army under General MacArthur's command. This was called the U.S. Army Forces in the Far East, or USAFE. December 7th, 1941, I'm sure some of us are familiar with that date. Their worst fears were confirmed. America declared war against Japan after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, beginning the Pacific War of World War II. So the Japanese strategy to weaken the American power was twofold. The Japanese naval and air forces had to destroy the American Pacific Fleet in Pearl Harbor and then attack the Philippines to cut America's lines of communication in the Pacific. So get rid of resource and power, military power, and get rid of communication. In addition, subjugation of the Philippines was part of the general plan of conquering the resource-rich countries of Southeast Asia so that their natural resources could be used for Japan's war machine. And they moved very quickly. 4 hours after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, Japanese bombed strategic American military points in the Philippines. It was 4 hours after bombing Pearl Harbor. So they were not exactly attacked unawares, but the Filipinos were completely outnumbered both in artillery and in soldiers. And the Japanese bombed Manila, even though General MacArthur declared it an open city. So, but open city means that it's been demilitarized, right? It is not defended, and because it's not defended, it shouldn't be attacked. This is international law. When a general or a leader says, this is an open city, you can literally come and occupy it. We will not resist you. But the Japanese violated this, and they bombed Manila. Thousands killed and thousands were wounded during the bombings. General MacArthur then retreated to Bataan Peninsula, where he could hold back the Japanese. At this point, months dragged on, and aid from America was impossible since the Japanese Navy commanded the sea lanes in the Pacific. What's more, America and the UK agreed on a, quote, Europe first policy, which implied an Asia second policy. So the defenders of Bataan had no arms, no ammunition, no food, and no medicine. There was no way for America to give that kind of aid for the examples I just mentioned, right? And General MacArthur left on orders by FDR to go to Australia on March 11th, and he was replaced by General Jonathan Wainwright. April 9th of 1942, General Edward P. King, who was the commander of forces on Bataan, surrendered officially. 78,000 Filipino and American troops marched from Bataan to San Fernando, Pampanga, which history books now call the Bataan Death March. So here's a photo of these American and Filipino soldiers being taken. And this was recorded as a particularly cruel march. If you could not march, you would be shot and left for dead on the side of the street. And so the Japanese occupied the Philippines for 3 years after the initial bombing on Manila, right? So from 1941, from 1942 to 1945. So the first story I'm going to tell you today, right? These are all data, statistics, dates, events, names. But my paternal grandmother, Milagros, has a very different story. She was almost 4 when the war started. And she remembers noise above everything else. She just remembers noise. She remembers hearing planes bombarding the shores. And she remembers being so fearful that the family who lived over there has been killed. She remembers the sirens signaling the attack, which meant that her and her family had to run to an air raid shelter. She remembers the enemy artillery pounding the shore, the cracking of the wood, rumble of concrete exploding, and the screams and the cries of panicked civilians. She remembers noise. And it wasn't until much later that she was actually hearing the sounds of the war as it officially started. So, Japanese had won, at least for now, right? So for today, since my family is from the central region of the Philippines, I'm going to speak specifically on how they experienced the war in the Visayas, which is the central region. So this is a very sophisticated high-tech map that I pulled up from Google Maps. Okay, so this is not all of Visayas. This is just a close look of the 3 regions that I'll be talking about today, 3 provinces or something like states that we speak of today. So this is where I was born and raised, Cebu City. This is the central and main province of the Visayas. And my paternal grandmother, my dad's mom, was born and raised here in Negros, in Bacolod, which is over here. So remember when I said she was hearing sounds of the planes bombing the shores, because she was right by the one. Okay, so it was very close. So you can imagine something like, you know, being right under like a 4th of July celebration, right? Like those fireworks. Like it's right above you, feel it, you sense it without even seeing it. And here, this is Southern Leyte, where my maternal grandmother was born and raised, and she's sitting right here. This is Aliza, who I call the lending name. And right over here is Leyte Gulf, which is where the largest naval battle recorded in modern history occurred. Right, so the Battle of Leyte Gulf was right over here, like literally like in her, not really backyard, back ocean. All right, so the Japanese occupied the Philippines. What was life like under Japanese rule? After Manila became an occupied city, the commander-in-chief of the Japanese imperial forces, kind of like its mega super general, General Masaharu Homma, issued a proclamation announcing the end of the American occupation and the purpose of the Japanese expedition, and I quote, "To emancipate the Filipinos from the oppressive domination of the USA, letting Filipinos establish the, quote, Philippines for the Filipinos as a member of the co-prosperity sphere in the greater East Asia and making you enjoy your own prosperity and culture." Sounds good, right? All right. So let's take a look at this propaganda here, for those of you that can't read in the back. This was disseminated to the Filipinos after the Japanese had officially occupied the regions. "Dear Filipinos, have no fear anymore. Fighting is now over. American forces who have been squeezing your land and people with honey words and threatening swords for a long time have now entirely been driven away by protecting God of Asia, the Japanese forces. The only aim of the Imperial Japanese forces is to free Filipinos from the oppression of white men and establish a paradise for Filipinos on this beautiful land of Philippines." Okay, paradise. The irony is that the Japanese imposed worse conditions on the Filipinos in their avowed mission to liberate them from the Americans. Their civil liberties were suppressed and their economy was geared to the demands of the Japanese war effort. So I'm just gonna kind of delineate some ways in which their lives were changed. And this is by no means an exhaustive list. Cebu is the most important Japanese base south of Manila, that central region I showed you. And the entire city was fenced in by forced labor 20 feet high, with only 2 gates, a gate in the north and a gate in the south, both of which were manned by Japanese sentries. You could not exit or enter without your person, your cargo, and your papers being inspected. In addition to those sentries, there were neighborhood associations called the Huko, which were formed to regulate and monitor locals, kind of a sinister neighborhood watch, if you want to call it that. Banks were closed, properties were confiscated, travel was severely restricted. Government distribution stations handed out rice, corn, alcohol, and other essentials to those with ration tickets. I just realized that now that they wrote alcohol as an essential, but okay. So you can imagine, right? Industry was put to a halt. Prices for commodities, stuff that you could buy and sell, was sold for 5 times the cost before the war. Fresh fish was at a premium, and poultry and meat were basically non-existent. People subsisted on dried fish and hinamos, which is fermented shrimp fry or fish. I know that doesn't sound good, but it's actually really yummy, right, Mom? But it wasn't all bad if you had money, property, and if you signed an oath, a loyalty oath to the Japanese. So if you did all of that, and if you had money, you can go to the bar, you can go to the club, you could afford some diversion. So, of course, for the very poor, this was completely impossible. But for the rich, they could have some kind of fun. People were cut off from the news. The only news that they received was Japanese propaganda from Japanese broadcasting. People mostly relied on gossip and rumor. What's interesting about the news and information is that there was one particular station that Filipinos listened to, and it was Radio San Francisco. So it was actually American news in which they relied on to get something close to the truth. They couldn't trust if the Japanese was telling the truth if, let's say, the Americans were never coming back, or the Japanese had won a particular battle in a particular region of the country. So they relied mostly on gossip and rumor, and there was really no newspapers in the traditional sense. They would get the news from illegally, at the risk of their lives, through Radio San Francisco, and the rebels would type these up, and then they would disseminate them. And if you were caught, and some of them were, you would be executed, and then, tortured for the names of those you worked with, and then executed. In addition, women and girls at this time was forced into sex slavery for the diversion of Japanese soldiers, and these women are called comfort women. 200 Filipino women went public in the 2000s, and there's an estimated 200,000 comfort women in Asia, including China, Korea, and other Japanese-occupied territories. So in this picture that I have here, these are the comfort women who lived through the Second World War with the Japanese occupation, and they are protesting the Japanese government for acknowledgement and even reparations. So you have this Lula, or grandma over here, right? Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, we are victims of Japan's military sexual slavery. We were forced, we were abused, we were violated, and we were raped. So it took them 80 years? No, that can't be right. A long time to come forward. My students know I'm not good with math. Should have written the notes here. Okay. More than 50 years, definitely. All right, so some family portraits I want to share these so you can imagine these people in your heads. So unfortunately, I don't have any pictures of my paternal grandmother, Milagros, because like many of the civilians who lived through the war, all of their memorabilia was destroyed and burned. And so these are the earliest photos that my dad shared with me. On the left, you have Mila, her husband Jose, and my dad smiling on his lap, and his baby brother Raymond. And then you have Jose again, Mila's mother Mercedes, Raymond, and a much grumpier version of my father sitting on Mercedes' lap. There are actually a lot of photos in my house where there are grumpy children sitting on. Okay. And on this slide, we have Grandma. So this is Mercedes, right? Mila's mother holding my father when he was a baby. And this is my grandmother, and this is me. Aww. I have one more set. So this is like a really cute little, line of brothers here. So that's Mila, Mercedes, my dad, Raymond, Edward, Chris, and Richard. So Mila had 5 sons. And this is Mila's sister, older sister, Maria Lourdes, whose story I'll also share later on, and she's holding me here. Okay, so I'm going to tell you Mila's story now as a little girl as she was living through the Japanese occupation. Mila's grandparents owned and operated the very first hotel in Bacolod. It was a good business. Mercedes, the mother, kept the books, and Mila's aunts cooked and fed the lodgers. It was a popular hotel. Many people came through. It was well favored by foreigners and by locals alike. But in 1941, a Japanese officer who married one of the neighbors spotted Mila's father, who was an American. As you can imagine, it was very dangerous for you to be an American at this time. Like, you were literally the enemy. You're not allowed to roam free. So he spotted, right, the officer spotted Francisco, that was his name, who was an American. Although technically he was born in Uruguay, and he moved to New Mexico when he was 10, and he was nationalized there. But there's an American in the family. The officer reported him to the army, and the family was imprisoned in the Bacolod City Elementary School for 3 months. At the time, schools and colleges were used as concentration camps and prisons. It just seemed to make more sense. No one's going to school anyway at this time. And so they were there for 3 months. Mila was almost 4. And I asked her, said, Lula, what do you remember? What was life like over there? She says, well, it was a big building and a big room. I'm like, okay. How did you feel when you were there? And she says, I remember being so scared of the Japanese. Okay, well, what did everybody else do? Her mother and her older sister, Lourdes, made some extra money washing the American women's laundry. And she remembers just playing around, going to hiding spaces, things like that. But she recalls one time when she cut her knee, and everyone made a huge fuss. Everyone. They were so nervous about this cut. And she didn't understand. And so I was thinking about it. I said, okay, well, I'm pretty sure, right, if there was no access to medicine, and if she cut herself, let's say, on like something that was rusted, there was a serious danger of infection, and this little girl could die. But she's fine, obviously. And to this day, she still has a cut on her knee to remind her of when that happened. Okay, so they were there for 3 months, and every week, Mercedes and Mercedes' parents, right, Mila's grandparents would visit for 2 reasons. One, to bring Filipino food, because according to them, Japanese food was disgusting, and they could not stomach it, like, what is this? And for the second reason, they would go there and make an appeal every single time. And they would say, listen, yes, he's an American, absolutely, keep him. But my daughter and my grandchildren are not. They're Spanish. I'm not quite sure how the logic of that works out, but it worked, and they were released. And unfortunately, Francisco, who was the father, was transferred to the internment camp in Manila, so farther north, the Santo Tomas concentration camp. And this is probably the most famous camp in the Philippines. They've written books about it. And so while he was there, he often wrote letters home, just to let the family know that he was fine. He told them that his primary job there was to dig the graves for executed Americans. And one of the worst things that he ever saw was that after the Japanese military executed an American, soldiers then proceeded to gang rape his widow in front of the entire camp. But he survived it. And what saved his life was, believe it or not, the fact that he was a good gardener. Right? So fresh food was so scarce. But he was skilled in keeping a garden, and he was able to keep the Japanese officers' tables furnished with fresh food. And so he was valuable, right? He was valuable. And his role was valuable enough to prevent him from getting killed. And so the people staying in the camps was finally freed February 3rd of 1945 when the Americans came and liberated them. Meanwhile, His family lived in terror from the Japanese. They moved to new lodgings in Sebastian Street and took new lodgers, and this is Sebastian Street in the 1940s. What was interesting about this move is that they moved closer to the Japanese headquarters. And Mila remembers waking up every day at 6 a.m. listening to the Japanese military doing their exercises. And so that was like her alarm clock of fear, just like hearing them doing their exercises every day. The other reason, too, why this was so terrifying is because her older sister, Maria Lourdes, was considered to be so beautiful. She was like, refusing marriage proposals at the age of 12, okay? Like, it was serious. She was really, really beautiful. And so, being unmarried and being very beautiful and being close to the Japanese headquarters, the family was super worried that she was just like a walking target for sexual, violence. So much so that when they would hear the Japanese soldiers close by or the sentries close by, or they would come visit, they would just hide her in the closet. This was not uncommon. And my grandmother had said, this was so common that women would get raped and families would be so worried. In fact, in the early days, many husbands and brothers had died defending their wives and their sisters from sexual violence. She told me that she had a cousin named Margarita who was married at the age of 13 to and I'm using her words here, drunken Spaniard, just to avoid rape. I think she was very unhappy from what she told me. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit more about Maria Lourdes for the last section of my talk, but let's move over to Lula Ningning's story. 250 miles west of southern Leyte, where my maternal grandmother had a very different experience during the occupation. In her case, rather than being forcibly removed from her home, her family fled to refuge in the jungle. And so I have this word up here called buckwit, which is a bastardization of the English word evacuate. And the definition is one who flees in search of refuge, as in times of war, political oppression, or religious persecution, or to evacuate. This word is still used today for the southern region of the Philippines in which they are persecuted by the rebels against the government. And the photo I have up here is a current photo, actually. This isn't even a photo that was taken in the 40s of the jungle where my grandmother lives. Right? Very dense, hard to penetrate. These are banana leaves, so there's bananas, and these are the hills. And these were where the rebels lived. And this is where some civilians evacuated to for safety. So IDPs settled in Bakwi communities to hide out from the war under the protection of the guerrillas, as well as the dense terrain of the jungle. By no means an easy way to live. People who lived in Bakwi communities were able to enjoy a semblance of their lives before the war. These communities tilled the land and cleared the forests for farming, so they're able to produce vegetables. They raised livestock, like chickens and pork and pigs, that eventually became pork. And so they would take these goods and they would walk, my mom's laughing at me, and they would walk 3 hours to the market and where they would just barter goods, okay? So I need some chickens, what do you got? I got some pork, okay. So then, it was just, and it worked out really well for them. In addition, for their protection, they supplied the local militia or the rebels, the guerrillas with food, and they even had parties, right? They had fiestas and dances and even mass, Catholic mass if they could. I'm going to say they probably had them very quietly, but they had them nevertheless. So just like my other grandmother, there were really no pictures of my grandmother when she was little, and she was 6 at the time. So here are just some old-timey pictures of the place. So this is me. I think I'm 1. I'm holding my mom's purse, I believe. Maybe taking out some money. This is the World War II memorial for the USAF, the soldiers that were working with the U.S. Army. And this is my dad holding me at Malito Bridge when I was a year old. And this is my grandma and me. on the beach. Just to be clear, I'm pretty sure she's wearing clothes. All right, so then this is her story. Well, her story and her brother's story. So my grandmother was 6 at the time during the occupation. And she had an older brother called Eusebio, but they called him Bibong at the time. Well, they always called him Bibong, but his name is Bibong. And his story is a cliched case of being at the wrong place at the wrong time. And so Bibong was coming back from doing business at a nearby village called Barrio San Antonio. And he was passing by. I'm sorry, I should have did this first. This is just some old pictures of the evacuation in Leyte. Okay. So this is the municipal building where he was just walking by when the Japanese military captured him and imprisoned him along with many other men in the municipal building jail. So the Japanese had occupied southern Leyte at the time, and they were in the process of just rounding up all the men in the village. And their goal was very simple: round them all up and kill them, burn their bodies. So while he was there, while all the prisoners were there, the Japanese did not bother to feed the prisoners because they were going to die anyway, so what was the point? So Lula's older sister, Ining, went every single day to give Bibong some food. And Ining used my grandmother as a prop for looking like she was married. She was actually single. For some reason, the Japanese respected you just a little bit more if you were married. And so she pretended to be a wife. And my grandmother's tagging along at 6 years old. And here's what I still can't quite reconcile in my head. So she would go to the jail, and the soldiers absolutely loved my grandmother. They would put her on their shoulders, they gave her candy, they would give her hugs, everything. But for me, I couldn't understand it even. She doesn't understand it either, but that's how they behaved towards her. So they did this every day, and eventually all the prisoners were taken in an army truck to the local cemetery to be mass murdered. And this is a picture of the cemetery as it looks like today. Not much has really changed. So the process was easy. Take them to the cemetery, take them off the truck one by one, stab them with a bayonet. Does anyone here know what a bayonet is? What's a bayonet?
Isn't it like a knife on the end of a gun?
Exactly. It's like a knife at the end of a gun, right? So multitasking tool, right? So take them off the truck, stab them a couple of times, throw them onto a pile, okay? So I don't know if the luck would have it, but Bibong was one of the very last ones, and he was stabbed 13 times. He was stabbed 13 times, and they threw him onto the pile, and they then went back to town to get kindling for the fire. And they went to, it just seems so cruel to think about it now. They went to the same houses where they took these men and grabbed the doors and they grabbed the shutters to burn on their bodies. So they left. But Bibong was not dead, right? 13 wounds later, he was not dead. He was still alive. And so what he did was he mustered up all this strength, crawled over a wall, and he crawled over to the grave of a baby brother who had died when he was only a few days old. And I remember asking my grandma, I said, well, why did he do that? And my grandmother said that the reason he did that was because he didn't want to die alone. He wanted to die with family. And so he was lying there for a few minutes, and he's like, wait a minute, I'm not dead. Let me give this a shot. So he crawls across the street towards the river, okay, hoping that someone's there, hoping anything, right? Someone's passing, whatever. And in good fortune, the leader of the rebels was there with his band, waiting for anyone to escape, right? So a case of wrong place, wrong time, but also right place, right time in the end. And so the leader of the rebels, his name is Titing Iscanio, who became the mayor after the war. He got all his guys to go and carry Bibong back to Ningning's father's house. So they saved his life. An interesting sub-story in this part is that when they were carrying Bibong back to his father's house, Bibong and Ningning's father asked Ningning to look away. And I remember when she told me this part of the story, I was like, oh, is it because he was afraid, as a caring and loving father, that you would be traumatized? And she's like, no. It was because it was believed that if a woman looks at a bleeding man, that he bleeds worse. I haven't checked the logic or the science behind this, but that's what she remembers. So there was the house, and then there was a second house, which just functioned like a kind of a hideout. So they took him to the hideout, where he was safely recuperating from his injuries. But word got out that he had escaped, and the Japanese were looking for them. And so my great-grandfather took the entire family and they moved into the forest to be safe from capture. And they moved further and further in until they passed the line of rebels, and that's where they hid out until the war was over. And in that way, they managed to survive. And side note, it's really interesting how I found out about this Bibong story. I was in my house, we were just in the playroom with my kids, and my mom's like, oh yeah, your great uncle who said he could never find work because he was stabbed by the Japanese 13 times. And I said, what? Stabbed by the Japanese 13 times? And then I had the story. All right, so this is the last phase of my talk. The spies and the spied. So Bibong, right, they were worried that the Japanese would find him, and part of that fear was because of Japanese-paid Filipino spies, which was a real thing. So there were spies everywhere during the occupation because being a spy was an easy way to avoid getting killed or getting someone back from capture. So there were 5 dangers. This time, obviously, the Japanese military, disease, there was no medicine, conditions were awful and unsanitary. The rebels themselves, the guerrillas, hunger, and Japanese-paid Filipino spies. The picture that I have up here are is a bunch of guys who served in the Kempeitai, which is the Japanese secret police. They also operated not just in the Philippines, but any other Japanese-occupied countries, and they were known for their brutality. And I'm just going to list some examples here of what they used to do. So remember when I talked about having a radio in your house and how it was not okay, and if you were caught, that would be terrible for you. So if they found out that your house had an unregistered radio, they would raid your house, they would maim the occupants, and tortured and then thrown into the dungeons of Fort Santiago, where you would die of your injuries. They were fond of the water cure, which is what we would call today as waterboarding. If they captured a rebel, they would hang the rebel by the hand, hit him or her with a 4x4 piece of wood, burned with a hot iron, shocked with electric wire, to give up the names of any other rebels or places of the rebellion, and then, of course, executed afterwards. Resistance men and women were executed through decapitation with swords, and that was kind of their common means of execution, was not wasting bullets, just swords or the bayonets. The Japanese sentries on the streets, right, so they would patrol the streets, and they would slap men, women, and children for failing to bow to them, for not bringing the residence certificate, for not being understood, or for even having a face that they didn't like. They could just slap you, like, I don't like your face, okay? And for many Filipinos, this was so much worse than getting kicked or punched, because getting slapped was a sign of infantile condescension, like you were treated like a child. So at this time, right, Filipinos had to be careful of spies, and so if they heard of any kind of Japanese defeat, they had to be like, oh, that's terrible, even though internally they were super happy. Okay, And so what did the rebels have to do with this? Well, the rebels were quick to liquidate Filipinos suspected of collaboration. One particularly sad case that I read about was the rebels had murdered these washerwomen for doing the Japanese officers' laundry, just for doing their laundry. And it was like the scantest of evidence. Someone can, just say, oh yeah, that person is a spy for the Japanese, and the rebels would honestly believe you, okay? Okay, so this is the last story that I'm gonna share with you, and it's about my great aunt, Maria Lourdes. And so remember I said before how she was like very beautiful and, getting marriage proposals, right? So when they were living in Sebastian Street, a Japanese officer had fallen in love with Maria Lourdes. He would come to the house and court her with a bag of sugar. So he brought sugar for his sugar, I guess. This was really odd because, all the stuff that I just said, I know it was corny, sorry. This is really odd because, when all the things I just said, this is not how they proceeded to do things. So, he used to do that, and he was in love with her. And one day, one of their neighbors, right, a distressed panic, came to the house screaming, tearing at her hair, crying, and told Mercedes that her husband has been taken by the military and had accused them of being a spy. So this was a big deal. He was probably going to die. Well, tortured and then die. And so Maria Lourdes, hearing this, right, and I just finished telling you guys about how the headquarters was like this hub of fear and terror for many Filipinos. She heard this, marched over to the headquarters, right, and went on her knees and begged for this neighbor's husband's life, even lying and saying that he was her uncle. And so she went specifically to the Japanese officer who was in love with her. And it worked. It worked. He gave the neighbor's husband his liberty, and he was freed. And the Japanese officer told Maria that he wanted to get married after the war was over, but he didn't survive it. An American soldier had killed him. And the neighbor's family, after the war was over, they opened up a restaurant. And every time any of my family would come visit, it was always free. They never let them pay because it was a lifetime of debt that they wanted to pay back. And that's it. Those are all the stories I can tell you for now. Thank you all for listening to them, and thank you to my grandma for telling me her story, and to my other grandma. Thank you.
Okay, so I want to open it up now for questions for Dr. Alves from the audience, from you guys. I think that's definitely part of what we want to have go on here. So does anyone have any questions?
Hi, I just wanted to know how did you pronounce there was a name of a peninsula in there? It was
Bataan or Bataan, whichever one it was.
How would you pronounce it?
Bataan.
Bataan?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. Other questions?
Hello.
Hi.
Is there resentment towards the Japanese still today after so many years because of this in the Philippines and in those nations? Personally, here in the United States, we've kind of forgotten about these things in so many ways unless they're brought up like this. But over there, I don't know about because I haven't been there. So thank you.
That's a great question. It is interesting, this like convenient forgetting, right? Especially when Japanese culture is so fun with their anime and sushi and other Japanese things like Hello Kitty, or is that Korean? I'm not sure. I am totally stereotyping the culture right now. I can only talk about my parents, my family. I know that my younger sister who's here, Kristen, and my younger brother were totally into the whole Japanese stuff. And I recall one day my brother saying, "Why are you so interested in those monsters?" And so I think maybe, my mom's laughing, and I think maybe for their generation it's still so real, but maybe for the younger people it's not quite as vivid, right, the resentment. So that's the only way I can explain it.
Could you elaborate on why you think the Japanese treated the Filipinos this way and why all of this happened?
That's an interesting question because, the Japanese, they said that their mission was to give the Philippines back to the Filipinos, right? But their conduct was so contrary to this. And so part of that was really just subjugating the Filipino people into recognizing the Japanese Empire as the sole controlling force in East Asia. Also, a lot of it has to do with some of these atrocities were committed even after the Japanese found out that they were losing. And so that's a kind of psychology that I can't even begin to address, so I'm not sure.
This isn't as relevant, but there's a lot of controversy with the president of the Philippines today. So I'm just curious what you thought, being Filipino-American.
Well, he just had a very nice conversation with Donald Trump. I hear that they're good friends now. My mom's actually going. My parents are going on Saturday. Right, Mom? You're leaving Saturday to go over there. And prices are at a historic low, maybe because there's unregulated shootings going on. It's interesting because it's kind of the same thing, because Rodrigo Duterte, which is who is the president of the Philippines, wants to completely eradicate Western influence. But he's also friends now with Trump, so I don't know anymore. I don't know what is the right answer to this, because it seems like it changes with the wind. So I don't know. We can only know what he says today. I don't know what he's going to say tomorrow.
Hi. When your great uncle was saved by the rebels, did he ever thought about joining them, or?
Did he? I don't think so, right? No, I don't think he joined the rebels. I think he was sort of turned off by fighting in general when he was, basically punctured 13 times. And it's funny because he would, and it was a joke in the family that he was just using the excuse of the 13 stab wounds to get out of everything. I can't go to the party because I was stabbed 13 times. I can't go find a job because I was stabbed 13 times. So I don't think so. I'm pretty sure he didn't join the rebels.
Any last questions? Yeah.
I wanted to ask, has the Japanese government acknowledged the atrocities that occurred in the Philippines?
I don't know. Thank you, Nicole, for asking me a question I can't answer. I'm not sure. Do you know anything? Oh, there seems to be someone who can answer or is that a question or an answer?
I have some answers.
Okay, great.
First, I want to say your talk was fantastic. I'm so glad I came. I've been involved with the Holocaust Center here for all of the 30 years and maybe more. Several years ago, we found comfort women in Korea, and we were able to bring them to the campus. But as time has gone by, of course, they're very old now. Now, when you think of that in terms of the age of the audience here, you say, well, they suffered terribly, but then they went home. But that's not what happened, because the professor gave you an idea that the culture of the 40s and 50s was very different. These women were looked upon as used as dirt. They were not taken back by their families. They lived alone forever. And in answer to your question about comfort women, we do have a lot of dialogue with the one remaining. There were 5 or 6 about a decade ago that on the anniversary of their return to Seoul, Korea, stood in front of the consulate of Japan. They didn't want reparations. They wanted an apology. They're still waiting.
Yeah, I think I went through the same.
That apology has never come.
Yeah. In my reading anyway, I haven't heard of anything like near an acknowledgement or an apology. Thank you.
Thanks, Kat. That was wonderful. I was wondering about the aunt whose story you told at the end, the one who was courted by the Japanese officer. So did she eventually consent that she was going to marry him after the war was over? Because you said he ended up dying and they never got married.
Yeah, I think she was like, yeah, sure. And, you know, because he, in many ways, he provided protection, right? Absolutely. And so, and he just conveniently died during the war. And I mean, my great aunt's life could fill books. But yeah, she didn't marry him, and I think he kind of functioned as a kind of safety net for the family too, right? Like the connection to.
Yeah, so that was going to be my follow-up question. How did the family feel about her consenting to this? So they kind of saw it as kind of a source of protection. And do you know of any other Filipino women who ended up in a similar situation? Either they were courted or they actually married, and how they were viewed by family and by society, sort of marrying the enemy?
Yeah, they would be called like collaborators, right? Yeah. But after the war was over, the president officially pardoned all collaborators and spies, because he said, well, then I'm a collaborator, you know, because I did things for the Japanese because I had no choice. So I think people were more forgiving. Definitely not with the comfort women. That was a completely different gendered issue. Yeah. Mom, do you know of anyone who married a Japanese officer at the time? No? So, we don't like Japanese. That's what she said. You know this is recorded. Oh, that was the other thing. It was actually pretty rare for Japanese men to marry Filipino women because it was a kind of miscegenation, right? It was like a impure, we were reading like some pure bloodline. So, you know, I think it's a sweet story that he was in love with my great aunt. So, thank you. Thanks.
If I may add, regarding the comfort woman, the reason why they collecting all single girls. Oh, sorry. If I may add, regarding the comfort woman, the reason why they did not take a married woman, but single girls only. They, at the beginning, they had the Japanese, the working girls. But then they had a big issues with disease, sexually transmitted disease. Therefore, they studied to comfort women from all different countries, but only single women. At that time, single meant virgins, therefore no disease. That's how they started collecting all the girls. And one story you gave us, excellent. That's how girls got married real quick.
Yeah.
Whoever the man was, they didn't care. They just married off their girls.
Okay, yeah. Thank you.
So I think Professor Alves can answer some more questions afterwards, but what I'd like to do now is maybe open up the table to the Creative Writing Club, who, if you guys can come on up here.
Hi, I'm Professor Miller in the English department. And thank you, Kat, Professor Alves, it was great. We were discussing how we might involve student writers in this event. And one of the things I do is I co-advise the Creative Writing Club. And we have two of our accomplished students here with me to participate. So when Professor Alves and I were discussing how to involve students, we thought that we'd start with family. And this idea of that all of us have family and we always learn about our family and our histories at some moment, some sort of secret family history or some intense moment where we learn the historical events of our family and that it's very memorable to us. So we thought we'd start with that. And I have two of I have Nicole Archie here and Caroline Sanchez. They're both Civil Rights Archive writers in residence. Just to let you know about that, they are currently going to Queens College and looking at the Civil Rights Archive that they have there. And then they are engaging with the materials and then producing creative work. So I gave them a challenge. I said, we need some poems about secret family histories. And because they're fantastic, they said okay, and I'm grateful to them that they're here to read their work with us. So we thought we might just start with reading some of our work, and I'm going to participate as well, and then just sort of have a brief discussion about writing and engaging in this material. So who's first? So Caroline Sanchez.
All right, I'm so short. This is unnamed. I didn't think of a name. Okay. Theo tells me about his trip, how he swam through a cold river with clothes that weigh him down, but how his heart and his pride, it stayed afloat. Mommy tells me something else, a plane, she says, with the stern and sure voice. She took a plane, and that's the story. No escuchas a su tío, so I don't ask her again. I don't tell her what he said. Theo tells me about the arrival, New York in the 80s, prostitutes in Manhattan. That makes him laugh. Not like now, he says, not the NYC I love. Mommy never told me about her arrival, 'cause her story only began when Christian and I became all of her pages. Theo tells me he slept on the floor with two other men in a studio apartment. My privilege shows when I respond with wide eyes and a fixed, unblinking expression. But I lived in a studio and shared a bed with Mommy. And I too cross rivers and write my own pages with experience as my pen and troubles as my ink. So when does their story become mine? When does the story of their past blend into the tale of my future? I'm blinking through blank pages that I've had to fill with a wild imagination, writing wondrous adventures that overpower the tragic ones I know they've endured. But Mommy says there will come a time when I'll tell you all of my life. You'll say, "Guau, ¿por qué no lloras?" So I leave some pages crisp, clean, and empty, where she'll one day write, but I often wonder when that time will come, and if it'll bring tears to my eyes or a smile to my mouth, or maybe even both.
Hi, my name is Nicole Archie. And this is a story in the form of a lyrical essay of why I'm here today. It's called Silent. My great-grandfather's tongue was taken by his own hand through false propaganda that seeped into his mind and forced him to believe his own false inferiority. In the waters was when my grandfather's tongue was ripped away by the hands of his own blood at such a young age that he didn't see the problem. So he spent his life speaking in the assimilations of his father, the speech I inherit today. Instead of the island jerk I was intended, I speak with a big apple in my mouth, with the forgotten knowledge of proper O and ing pronunciation that I remember only through my great-grandfather when I have to code switch, though not as heavily as he. Instead of knowing the ins and outs of my family's homeland, Grenada, I know the ins and outs of New York City. like to get the best dollar pizza when you're hungry in Central Park, when and where to practice the art of jaywalking, and how to navigate my way to the J train when the E delays, which is a lot. Though I'm grateful for knowing Queens, I wish I knew more about Carriacou and where to find the sandiest beaches with the clearest waters, and how to make a concoction of natural remedies to treat my sunburn from overstaying my welcome at those beaches. I wish I were more familiar with red paired with green and yellow than white and blue, where the sweet smell of nutmeg brings me home rather than pizza and cigarettes, where the image of a beautiful dove tells me I'm free rather than a misleading eagle. I wish I knew these facts off the top of my head instead of having to ask Google. I have blood in this world miles away that I know nothing about. That bothers me. It feels like a piece of me that I never knew was there is just waiting to be discovered, but I don't know where to place a magnifying glass. A secret that was never really a secret, but a mystery that nobody bothered to solve. But who wouldn't want to know their past when they belong to a whole nother country? I guess it starts with me. Thank you.
Okay, and I wanted to also share something because I have a work that I wrote in graduate school, and when Professor Alves was telling me about our talk, it inspired me to sort of look up this work because I had written about family myself, and I'll just give a little context here. It involves a moment where I met my great aunt, who's from Puerto Rico. It was right after college, and she was single, living alone in a nursing home, and she chose me to confide in and give me her story. What I would learn from her is that she was, victim of a sort of the widespread sterilization that went on in Puerto Rico, something that I didn't know about at the time, and something I would later learn. She was also very enthusiastic that I was a writer and very supportive of me. And she told me her whole story. And I wrote about this 10 years ago. And so I was just going to share a little excerpt from this. And just to give you a little context, it's fiction. So I was focusing on this moment when she told me this and this story. And I was, I didn't want to write it in a realistic way. So I came up with this sort of fictional narrative where the first person narrator is a street playing piano player, so like a street performer who plays the piano, who has a sort of supernatural ability to communicate telepathically with his audience members. So it was basically, I took a real thing and then I sort of am making it fiction. That was the idea. So here's a scene where the narrator is playing a piano on the street in San Juan, Puerto Rico, and he encounters a woman who's just listening to him play the piano. So it says, "I'm within the subtlety of sati, lonely gestures at this new dusk. A sickness has channeled through my body, and I hear a woman humming along. She's the only one in the square, standing some 20 feet away from me. We're the only people around, and there is no noise or sound that would be expected during a regular business day. She must have crept up from some confined space. She's elderly, and with shaking hands clenches a handbag, giving me a questioning gaze at why I am so convinced of the misery of the keys. Her eyes tighten, and I can't help but see my own self-consciousness. I'm self-loathing to the point of paralysis. I'm afraid of her sincerity. She must laugh at my notions of misery, my infantile sorrow that goes through my mind as I play, but not a sound is uttered from her lips. I play on, striking F-sharp, hitting everything, remembering posture, what it means to be great, to become a dedicated champion of the octave with arched hands, never flat, staccato, flickering candlelight, bold strikes to the keys followed by a smoothing palm. These things are done to pursue dreams. The quickness of cadence, the descendo has nothing to do with remembering, but has everything to do with practice. I'm reminded of hot rooms on the weekend, home concerts with fanning programs, and to be nothing short of the best. My teacher's marble Beethoven, his specially ordered head of bronze, these European faces constantly around me, hovering above and appearing as one-way mirrors on a ceiling, the tortured stare of success. These were rooms where people were their most refined, on their best behavior, people funneled in on summer days. Their genius resided in the fact that they never spoke about how much they didn't know. Of course, all of the music was beautiful. The few who knew bad interpretations would snicker in the first row. The ordered lines of the folding chairs always said something to me about the construct of the music. I remember the men would stand around silently after the concerts, smoking cigars, waiting for their families. The woman in front of me begins to cry. Her tears have finally let loose and she drops to her knees. There's something greater at work here, something that I wouldn't possibly be able to understand. She makes her contact with me in her mind, a cerebral extension bridging the space between us, and I'm now privileged to know everything, the air, the bruises, the loss. The spaces between us were once occupied by people. Now the air is filled with her memories. Like the clouds above the retracting sea, our minds are now indistinguishable in the physical form. She drops the handbag and stands up to hug me, and I realize that she has nobody, that she's been left here in this square, dropped off and forgotten about for years. There's nothing more than what I see. She has wandered and wandered, making a trail that spirals until the line lifts off into the air. That most of us forget that we are lucky enough to breathe. Her arms are open and waving towards me as her tears fall. She knows my name and she says it. What? She orders me to stop the performance, and I realize that to provoke silence is her only wish. I fall off the bench. The vision is unlike anything that I've experienced. This music begins to hurt. I look up to her. She's standing rigid, piercing my cortex with her empathetic fingers. There's no confusion here. This is the only thing going on. She orders me to stop the whole performance. Her tears and wails are at the end of something that exists in the impossible spaces in which we grow. She kneels, crumbling like concrete amidst dynamite's fiery laugh. She begins to writhe on the ground, rolling in the dirt. I can't do anything but follow, so I drop to the pavement and I listen as she finally begins to speak. Thanks for listening. So just a couple questions for my student panelists, right? Because we were going to talk about that initial focus in this writing process. So maybe Nicole, you want to start? What moment did you decide to focus on when I gave you this task?
Well, I was in the kitchen one day and I just something just told me to ask my mom, you know, like, why are we here, you know? Like, do we have any like hidden family secrets? And she said that, you know, we have family overseas in Grenada. And I was just like, what? Wow. So I chose to focus on the story she told me of my great-grandfather and how he came over here with my grandfather fresh off the boat, but he was ashamed of his culture. So he assimilated heavily into American culture. So yeah.
Well, you gave us the task, right, to think of like an uncovered story. So I was thinking like in terms of how my family came to America and how there are so many versions of the story and I don't know which one's the correct version. So I kind of mixed them together and also like through that process kind of asked myself, where do I fit into this story and when does their narrative start to blend into my own narrative of being here? That was it.
Great. And we talked about how, you know, we're approaching this very differently, and Professor Alves did such a great job with weaving the historical and the personal. So maybe we'll just finally end with just sort of like, what's it like to write about family like this? Like, how was it for you? Was it easy, difficult, liberatory? It could be very difficult to approach this.
Well, it felt very good, like just to like write about something that I never really speak about and something I don't know a lot about. So it was nice to, you know, go on Google and get some facts about the country that's in my blood that I don't really know very well.
I said that it was hard to write about family because you want to keep secrets and sometimes you feel like it's not even your story to tell. But then you think like if they're not going to say it, who's going to say it? Because then it'll just stay forever in the past and just be a memory but not like a story. So I think it's important to continue telling stories that aren't even yours. Like Dr. Alves came up and told like her whole family story, and that's important because that touched us. So we should do the same.
Great. Maybe we'll leave it there. Thank you.
That was was really, really beautiful. And I want to wrap up. We have the Journalism Club here as well, and they're going to come up and, yeah.
Hello. I prefer to not have the microphone, if that's okay. Can you all hear me? Yeah. Okay. So my students here are in my journalism class. They also are, by way of the class, members of the journalism club, so they write for the school newspaper. And we operate under the auspice of the Society of Professional Journalists Code of Ethics, which 4 major tenets, you guys should be able to rattle those off by now, I hope, which is to seek truth, to minimize harm, to act independently, and to be accountable and transparent. So I think what we would like to discuss today is how journalism and journalists are responsible for getting the message out to the world, particularly when there are things going on, like Dr. Alves spoke about her family. And unfortunately, these types of situations are still happening in various parts of the world today, some of which are going unreported or uncovered, and we really need to consider the role of the journalist who goes behind in hostile territory or behind enemy lines, so to speak, and cover that subject matter and then get it out to the world at large to raise awareness. So I'm wondering if you all could address what you thought of the connections between journalism and Dr. Alves' talk and this wonderful talk that you gave us about her family history. If there's anything you can add here.
Okay. Well, free speech and freedom of the press is one of the most valuable things that we have here in the United States, and you can see from her story exactly what not having those things can lead to. And specifically, I remember she mentioned the fact that they couldn't even trust their own media. They had, excuse me, no idea what was going on in their own country. So I think that's a very valuable gift that we have here that we need to fight for. And it's been coming into question lately with politics and with our president kind of attacking journalists and the press. And so I think right now is obviously a really important time to think about that.
Yeah, I agree with Gisela. It's very important as journalists to uncover the truth of things that could be hidden that, you know, the public or the large community would not know about. And like, it just shows, like, for example, with what happened with like how the media was so suppressed and like controlled that like the large community and the people who were actually in the country experiencing, you know, all these terrible things, they didn't have the right to even know like what's happening behind closed doors with their government that got, you know, taken over. And like, you know, it's important for like journalists to actually go out and, you know, the outside world to see what's really happening, to like tell the public and even the people living through, you know, certain things. Like they have a right to know since they're living, you know, through these situations themselves, but what's really happening.
Yeah, I think now journalism is like more important, like more than ever. Like with everything going on, you know, it's good to uncover like what's really happening, what's really happening, the hidden story. You know, there's so much like hidden like gems and so much things you can discover just by like going out and like seeking the truth and you know uncovering like secrets. Like there's so much we can learn. And if you look, if it's suppressed, like, you know, no one's getting the information, then we're all just like kept in the dark and we're not able to like know what's going on. And I think through like reporting and like, you know, having everything like uncovered and in the open, we're able to like, you know, deepen our minds, like have a new perspective and like be more like in touch with our world and our community and like with other people.
I think our president could learn a lot from this talk.
There's one more major thing I think was touched upon today, and that is the idea of propaganda, which was clearly used during World War II, particularly in countries that were being occupied by other governments. And what possibly do you think the equivalent of propaganda today may be, our equivalent almost that's out there, because we have such an open society on the web with so many things and so much information out there in terms of separating, you know, the wheat from the chaff. What is news? What's not news? So what can we call perhaps modern day propaganda right now?
Maybe like in my opinion, it might be like
the separation of like the political parties, like Democratic, Republican, everything has to be like in a certain bubble or like aspect, like, oh, you're liberal or you're, what's the other one? You're conservative. So like there's nothing like in between, like everything has to be put in a bubble. And then you kind of hidden like, oh, I don't know, just the fact that like the media could be separated in like that type of view with politics. And, you know, like people have a right to like, I guess have their own say without like being put in that certain category of, yeah, so like, okay, like if you're conservative, you like report only news that like, you know, follows like your conservative views and values. So, you know, you're hiding and like kind of propaganding what your, I guess the people that like follow up on you, like what they say. And like, you know, stuff like that, that matter.
Any questions from the audience about reporting, about news coverage, or yes?
Just a couple.
Should I come with you to bring the microphone, or?
Okay, Amy, no, I can speak up louder. Yeah, if I need to. I'm very interested in the free speech argument. As recently we have seen what is happening at Berkeley in California as a violation of the free speech that one side has. And I think that it's important, and you mentioned the political thing too, to say, okay, if you allow one side to be silenced, what you're actually doing is cutting your own throat for the future. And what we have seen in modern day news broadcasting, people will lose their jobs if they do not take on the position of their employers. So making this into a question also. But I think that's interesting how we see the Holocaust and we see these things that happened in World War II and how we can kind of look at our society in this moment, in this week, and see how that is happening to us too. And the propaganda is not so much in what they speak with their mouth, but it's interesting for all of us to sit and look and watch and see what it is that they're not saying. Why are they not talking about Venezuela? Why do we speak about that we hate slavery, but yet we allow it to happen in countries in Africa that our government knows about right now? Okay? So the question is there any type of a organization or a thing that is behind the scene with journalists who have gone out onto a limb and assumed a pen name, per se, because of fear of retribution, because of the forces I'm talking about, a thing that they can go out and they can speak the truth on, an alternative type of resource or something. Is that available, or is it also fear that that's going to just be another thing that no matter what you say, if it's against the establishment, you know, that's fake news. Thank you.
Well, some of the things that you mentioned before with the Code of Ethics were transparency. So I definitely agree with you that it's important to be completely transparent and to express both sides, excuse me, of the problem, and then let the audience or the readers decide what their point of view is. And another point that you said, I think I just forgot my point. Minimizing harm is another point of the Code of Ethics. And so we actually recently discussed the Watergate scandal and how the witness who came forth only just recently gave his name. So that's a good example of how the reporters protected the individual who gave them the information that was so important, and it ended up working out. One question that I have when that happened is I wonder if, had they not had enough evidence to be convincing and to have the same effect without releasing his name, I wonder if they would have had to release his name anyway. Does that make sense? Okay.
Well, the expression is time heals all wounds, so to speak. So there was I guess in the field, an appropriate amount of time had passed since Nixon's impeachment, his presidency, his subsequent death than anything associated with that administration at the time. But I don't have all the right answers to that one, or it could have just been a matter of, it's time. It's time for the American public to know who the person was, who had all of this landmine of information available that cracked Watergate wide open. And it may have to be that there is a waiting period that could be several years, decades long in that regard.
Any other questions?
Yes.
I think I can speak about it right now. What I would say, like, with the question you posed about propaganda today, like, I disagree with the whole "it's what you say" thing, because it's really not what you say. It's actually what you see. Because like if I were to have a speech and everything with no pictures whatsoever, you'd only remember probably 25% of the speech. But if I put pictures up, with maybe some words and some other things like that, on the picture, you will remember that picture for a very long time. So it's really what you see and not what you hear. So propaganda is all about seeing these things repeatedly over and over and over until it sticks with you, probably until something else changes it. So that's why political cartoons, cartoons in general, things like that, that's why they stay with you longer than the speech and what someone says. But the thing about a speech is that you won't remember what the person says, but you remember what you felt. So like the body remembers what it feels at that moment, which is muscle memory.
Very good point. You guys want to respond to that?
Especially with the way social media is such a huge factor right now. I definitely think that our generation especially will react more to visual media rather than reading. So I definitely agree with that. And maybe we do have to think about how we reach out to people when we're trying to communicate a message. Maybe we do need to change with the times. So that's a good point. Okay. All right. Great. Thank you to the Journalism Club. Thank you to the Thank you to Dr. Alves, and thank you to Dr. Alves' family, and to you guys for being here today. Really, enjoyed having you.